Sheriff Silas Crow slammed the document down on the bar so hard that every glass rattled and every conversation in the Lucky Spur saloon died. "Read it." His voice carried the particular coldness of a man who had never once been told no. "Read it out loud, boy. Let everybody hear what your daddy left behind." Garrett Holloway didn't reach for the paper. He stood at the far end of the bar with whiskey he hadn't touched, and he looked at Crow the way a man looks at something he has hated for a very long time. "I know what it says." "Then say it." The saloon held its breath. 40 people packed into a smoke-thickened room, and not one of them moved. They all knew what was on that document. They had all heard the rumors. But there was something different about watching Garrett Holloway have his inheritance stripped in public on a Tuesday night with 17 minutes left before midnight. "The will states," Crow said, picking up the paper himself since Garrett wouldn't touch it, "that Iron Ridge Ranch transfers to the Crow County Land Authority. That's me. If the eldest Holloway son fails to produce a lawfully wedded wife before the stroke of midnight on the 30th anniversary of his birth." He set the paper back down. He smiled. "Happy birthday, Garrett." Garrett's jaw tightened. Crow pulled out his pocket watch and held it up so the whole room could see. 17 minutes. If you've ever watched someone you care about get backed into a corner with no way out, if you've ever stood in a room where injustice is happening right in front of you and nobody moves, then you already know exactly what Garrett Holloway felt in that moment. But here's what nobody in that saloon expected. He wasn't the one who was going to change everything that night.
Sit.
Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and stay with us. Stories like this one are why this channel exists, and I promise you, you do not want to walk away before the end. Hit the like button. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that saloon, because the next 12 minutes are going to change 4 lives forever. The Holloway name had meant something in Caldera County once. Garrett's grandfather had broken the first ground at Iron Ridge with a single mule and 30 feet of rope. His father, Douglas Holloway, had expanded it into 1,200 acres of the most productive grazing land in the territory. People had looked at the Iron Ridge brand the way people look at something permanent, the way you look at a mountain and assume it will always be there. But Douglas Holloway had been a proud man in the worst sense of the word. Proud the way a man gets when he stops listening, when he starts signing papers without reading them, when he lets a charming county official buy him drinks and explain complicated arrangements in simple language. Silas Crow had been buying Douglas Holloway drinks for 11 years. And somewhere in those 11 years, between the whiskey and the handshakes and the documents with fine print that Douglas never quite got around to examining, Crow had constructed a financial trap with exactly one exit. And that exit had a door that only opened if Garrett Holloway stood in front of it, married before midnight on his 30th birthday. Nobody understood why Douglas had agreed to that condition. Some said Crow had convinced him it was tradition, a motivator, a way to make sure the boy settled down. Others said Douglas had never believed it would actually matter, had assumed Garrett would be married long before 30. A few of the older men in town, the ones who remembered Douglas in his final years, hunched and quiet, suspected that Douglas had simply not understood what he was signing, that Crow had slid that page in among others, that Douglas's hands had been shaking too badly to read the fine print by then. Nobody said any of this out loud. Not in Caldera County. Not with Crow wearing a badge. Garrett had known about the condition for exactly 43 days. He had found the original will in a lockbox beneath his father's bed 2 months after the funeral, when he'd finally worked up the will to clean out the room. He had stood in that bedroom for a long time holding the paper. Then he had gone outside, sat on the fence rail, and stared at Iron Ridge until the sun went down. He had tried. He wanted that understood, at least by himself. He had called on 3 women in Caldera County. Not romantically. He wasn't built for romantic gestures even under normal circumstances. And these circumstances were about as far from normal as a man could get. He had been direct. He had explained the situation. He had offered a fair financial arrangement. The first woman had thrown a pot of cold coffee at his head. The second had laughed until she cried and then told him to leave before her husband came home. The third had listened carefully, nodded, and then told him she'd need 2 weeks to consider. That had been 3 weeks ago. He had not heard from her. So here he was. Tuesday night, his 30th birthday. 17 minutes, now 16. and a saloon full of witnesses watching Silas Crow enjoy the best night of his professional life. "You could just concede," Crow said, tucking his watch back into his vest pocket. "Save yourself the embarrassment. Sign the transfer papers tonight. I'll let you stay on as a hired hand. You know the land. That's worth something." "You'd let me work my own land," Garrett said. His voice was very flat. "It won't be your land in 16 minutes. Garrett picked up the whiskey glass. He didn't drink from it. He set it back down. Then he turned to face the room. What happened next was something that people in Caldera County would still be arguing about 20 years later, whether it was brave or desperate, whether it was the act of a man with a plan or a man with nothing left to lose. Garrett Holloway climbed up onto his bar stool and then onto the bar itself, and he stood there above that crowd in his dusty boots and his worn coat with the frayed left cuff, and he spoke. "I need a wife." His voice was rough, not commanding. A working man's voice, not a performer's. "I need one tonight, before midnight. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He paused. "Iron Ridge is 1,200 acres. There's a main house and 2 outbuildings. My father left debt I'm still working through, but the land itself is sound. I'm 30 years old, and I know cattle, and I know fence line, and I'm not easy to live with, but I'm not cruel." Another pause, shorter. "I'll pay. Whatever's fair. If you're unmarried and you're willing, I'm asking." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room full of people deciding all at once how to react. Then someone laughed. It started in the back, a single sharp bark, and it spread the way laughter does when people have been holding tension and need somewhere to put it. Within seconds, half the saloon was laughing, and the other half was looking at the floor or at their drinks, doing the polite thing of pretending not to see a man humiliate himself. Crow was not laughing. He was watching with the careful attention of a man who is mostly certain the situation is under control, but wants to make absolutely sure. Garrett stood on the bar and took the laughter. He didn't climb down. He didn't change his expression. He just stood there and waited for it to die, and when it didn't die fast enough, he said louder, "I mean it. Someone name a price." More laughter. A man near the window called out, "I'll sell you my horse, Holloway. She's better company than most women I know." That got the biggest laugh of all. Garrett's hands tightened at his sides. He was calculating, his mind still working even now. How many minutes, whether Crow's watch was fast or slow, whether there was any angle he hadn't considered yet. He hadn't noticed Mabel Ashcroft. Almost nobody ever noticed Mabel Ashcroft, which was one of the great ongoing failures of Caldera County's collective perception. She was 34 years old, heavy-set in the way of a woman who had spent 15 years doing physical work in a kitchen, with strong hands and dark hair that she kept pinned back, because loose hair and open flames were a combination she had stopped tolerating around age 19. She had been the head cook at the Lucky Spur Saloon for 11 of those 15 years, and she was so consistently present, so reliably there, that most of the saloon's regular customers had stopped actually seeing her around the same time they stopped seeing the tables and the chairs. She had become furniture. Competent, indispensable, invisible. She was standing at the edge of the kitchen doorway because she had come out to see what the noise was. She was holding a dish towel. She had been in the middle of scrubbing a pot. She watched Garrett Holloway stand on the bar and be laughed at. She watched his hands tighten and his jaw set and his eyes do a slow, controlled sweep of the room. Not panicked, not desperate, just searching, calculating. She recognized that look. She had worn it herself in more situations than she cared to count. She looked at the clock on the wall behind the bar. 14 minutes. She looked at Crow, who was now examining his fingernails with the elaborate casualness of a man performing contentment for an audience. Then Mabel Ashcroft untied her apron, folded it, and set it on a nearby table. People would later claim they saw her moving through the crowd toward the bar. In reality, hardly anyone noticed her until she was already there, standing below Garrett, looking up at him with an expression that was not pity and not mockery and not any of the things he'd been seeing in people's faces for the last 5 minutes. "Get down from there," she said. Garrett looked at her. He took a second to place her. He had eaten at this saloon dozens of times, knew her face the way you know a face you have never thought to attach a name to. "I'm trying to... I heard what you're trying to do. Get down. You look foolish up there." He climbed down. He wasn't sure why he did it. Stubbornness usually kept him doing things past the point of wisdom. But something in her voice was a gear he didn't have a way to strip, and he climbed down. Crow straightened slightly. Something shifted in his expression. "You're Holloway?" Mabel said, though obviously she knew. "Garrett. Yes." "You're serious about this?" "Yes." She looked at him for a moment, not sizing him up the way people size up a potential spouse, but the way a contractor looks at a building that might be worth saving. Something structural, something beneath the surface, something she was calculating in her own way. "Everyone heard what you said?" She raised her voice without raising it too much. A cook's voice, used to being heard over noise. Several people near them nodded, still grinning, expecting more entertainment. "He's offering land and money to any unmarried woman willing to marry him tonight." "That's right," Garrett said. Crow took a half step forward. "Now wait just a— I'm not talking to you, Silas." Mabel's voice didn't change pitch or volume. It had the quality of a door being shut. Crow actually stopped. She turned back to Garrett. The room had shifted. People were paying attention now in a different way. The laughter fading into something more uncertain, more interested. "Before I say anything else," she said, "I want to ask you something." Garrett waited. "Do you want a partner?" Mabel said. "Or just someone to save your inheritance?" The room went absolutely quiet. It was the kind of question that lands differently depending on who's in the room. For some of the men standing there, it seemed like an odd thing to pause on. It was a business arrangement. Why complicate it? For some of the women, it was the only question that mattered. For Crow, it was an irritation, a delay, a variable he hadn't accounted for. For Garrett Holloway, it was the first thing anyone had said to him in 43 days that actually required him to think. He looked at her. She waited. She was not going to move past this question. "I don't know," he said finally. Several people around them exhaled, some disappointed, some surprised. That was not the answer they had expected. "I mean, I came here for the second thing," Garrett said, slower now. "That's the truth. But He stopped. He tried again. "I've run Iron Ridge alone for 3 years. My father ran it by himself for 30. I watched what that did to him. He stopped a second time. "I was a man unused to saying true things out loud to strangers. I don't want to do it alone." Mabel looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I want half." The room erupted. Not laughter this time, something louder and more disorganized. A chaos of voices, someone saying she'd lost her mind. Someone else laughing, but differently than before. Crow's voice cutting through, saying something about this being absurd, this not being legal, this being exactly the kind of thing that— "Half ownership," Mabel said, still talking to Garrett and nobody else, raising her voice just enough to be heard over the noise. "Of the ranch, not wages, not an allowance, half. You put it in writing before we walk to the justice of the peace, or I go back to my kitchen and you lose everything in—" She glanced at the clock. 12 minutes. Garrett stared at her. "You're the cook," he said. He didn't mean it as an insult. It was a statement of the facts as he had understood them up until approximately 45 seconds ago. "I am," Mabel said. "And I've been managing the accounts for this saloon for 6 years because Tom Hicks can barely spell his own name, and I've kept this place out of debt twice when it should have gone under, and I know cattle prices and land valuation, and I can read a contract." She paused. "Half." Crow stepped forward fully now. "This is a spectacle," he said. "This woman is not— "Unmarried?" Mabel said, turning to look at him for the first time. "Last I checked." "You don't know what you're—" "I know exactly what I'm doing." She turned back to Garrett. 11 minutes. Yes or no?" Garrett Holloway looked at this woman he had eaten food cooked by 100 times without once asking her name, and he made a decision the way he made most decisions. Not with ceremony, not with confidence, but with the grim practicality of a man who understands that imperfect action beats perfect hesitation. "Yes," he said. The noise in the room changed again. Crow's face changed. Something moved behind his eyes that wasn't anger exactly. It was the expression of a man recalibrating, reassessing, reaching for a different tool. "This is not binding," Crow said. His voice had gone smooth. "A verbal agreement in a saloon? Then we'll write it down," Mabel said. She looked around the room and found what she was looking for. "Frank, you got paper?" Frank Delgado, who ran the general store and happened to be sitting 3 stools down nursing his Tuesday night beer, said, Yeah, I got a ledger page." Tear one out. Frank tore one out. Mabel looked at Garrett. You got a pen? He didn't. Someone pressed one into his hand from behind. He never saw who. Write it down, Mabel said. Iron Ridge Ranch, held jointly between Garrett Holloway and Mabel Ashcroft, equal partnership, signed this date. She watched him write. His handwriting was the handwriting of a man who had spent more time with fence wire than with pen nibs. Both of us sign, then we go. You can't just, Crow started. We'll formalize it properly in the morning with Judge Hale, Mabel said. This is witness enough for tonight. She was right about that, and Crow knew it. 20 people in that room had seen it written. 20 people had watched them both sign the ledger page. 20 people were witnesses to a legal agreement, imperfect as it was, that Crow's lawyers were going to have a genuinely difficult time unwinding. Mabel took the paper from the bar, folded it twice, and tucked it into her dress pocket. Let's go, she said. Garrett looked at Crow. He didn't say anything. He didn't smile or gloat. He just picked up his hat and put it on. Justice of the Peace lived 3 blocks away in a white house with a crooked fence. His name was Edmund Pratt, and he was 68 years old and had been woken from sleep by people needing urgent weddings before. He answered the door in his nightshirt with his reading glasses already on, which suggested that being woken for emergencies was a thing he had made peace with. I need a minute, he said, looking at both of them, looking at the group of saloon patrons who had followed at a distance out of sheer fascinated inability to go home. You have 9 minutes, Mabel said. Pratt peered at her over his glasses. You're Tom Hicks's cook. I am, and I'm about to be Garrett Holloway's wife, if you'll start talking. Pratt looked at Garrett. This you're doing? It's both our doing, Garrett said. Pratt looked at the crowd behind them, at Crow standing at the outer edge of it, with his arms crossed and his face carefully neutral. Pratt had known Silas Crow for 22 years. He didn't like what he knew. Come inside, Pratt said. The ceremony took 6 minutes. It was the plainest ceremony Edmund Pratt had ever performed, which was saying something. He had done a ceremony once in a barn during a hailstorm with a cattle brand as the only witness. But this was plainer. No flowers, no family, no music, no words beyond the legal minimum. Just 2 people standing in a Justice of the Peace's parlor at 4 minutes to midnight, in front of a man in his nightshirt and reading glasses, saying yes and signing their names. At 2 minutes to midnight, Mabel Ashcroft became Mabel Holloway. At 1 minute to midnight, Garrett walked back outside to where Crow was standing in the dark, and he said, It's done. Crow didn't speak for a long moment. He was looking at Mabel, who had come out behind Garrett and was standing beside him, not touching him, not performing anything, just standing there. This isn't over, Crow said. I know, Garrett said. That ranch has debts. You don't know how many. We'll figure it out. Crow's eyes moved to Mabel one more time. There was something in them. Not dismissal, exactly, which was what everyone else in town used for her. Something sharper than that. Something that looked, if you knew what to look for, like the beginning of worry. Enjoy your wedding night, Crow said, and walked away into the dark. Mabel watched him go. Then she said, without looking at Garrett, He's going to move fast. I know. How far out is the ranch? Hour's ride. You got horses? Mine's at the post. You ride? Adequately. She turned to look at him for the first time since the ceremony. In the lamplight outside Pratt's house, she looked tired. Not the tired of this one night, but a deep, seasoned tired, the kind that lives in someone for years. I need to go back to the saloon and get my things. I'll wait. She studied his face for a moment. Neither of them had yet developed the vocabulary for what they were to each other. The paperwork said married. Everything else was uncharted. There's something you should know, she said, about me, before we ride out. Tell me on the way. I'm telling you now. Her voice was quiet, but had that quality of a gear that wouldn't strip. I am not easy. I have opinions, and I will say them. I run things the way I see fit, and I don't apologize for it. If you're looking for a quiet woman who will nod at whatever you decide, I am the wrong choice, and you had other options tonight. Garrett looked at her for a moment. The other options laughed at me, he said. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile. I didn't laugh. No, you didn't. She went to get her things. He waited. The crowd that had followed them from the saloon had mostly dispersed. There was nothing left to watch, the drama concluded. A few lingered. Tom Hicks, the saloon owner, had come outside and was standing near the door with the expression of a man who has just realized his head cook has departed and is not certain what to do about that. Garrett stood by the horses in the quiet and looked up at the sky. A full month before, he had stood at the fence rail at Iron Ridge and stared at the land until the sun went down. And he had thought, "This is mine, and I am going to lose it." That thought had lived in him for 43 days, heavy and permanent as stone. It was lighter now. He didn't know what to call the thing that had replaced it. Not hope. He wasn't built for hope, especially not yet, not until he understood what he was walking back into. Not relief. The list of things that could still go wrong was long enough to keep a man awake for a month. But the stone was gone. Mabel came back out of the saloon with a canvas bag and a wooden box with a latch. She had changed out of her kitchen clothes into a traveling jacket that was plain but well made, the garment of a woman who understood quality without requiring display. "That your whole life?" Garrett said, looking at the bag and the box. "The important parts." She set the box on the ground and picked up the bag. "What do you know about the debts?" He took the bag from her. She let him, which told him that she was practical about assistance even if she didn't need it. "More than Crow thinks I know, less than I should." "Tell me while we ride." They mounted up. The dark road out of Caldera stretched ahead of them, rutted and lightless except for the moon. "My father borrowed against the land," Garrett said as their horses found their pace. 3 different notes. Crow holds all 3. "What interest rate?" "Crow's rate." Mabel made a sound that was not quite a word. "Meaning illegal." "Meaning whatever Crow decided to charge." "How far behind?" Garrett was quiet for a moment. "He's claiming we owe more than the land is worth." Mabel said nothing. The horses' hooves were loud on the hard road. "That make you want to go back?" Garrett said. He wasn't being sarcastic. It was a genuine question. Mabel shifted in the saddle. She was an adequate rider, as she'd said. Functional, no wasted movement. "I want to see the books." "The books may not be—" "I want to see them anyway." He looked at her in the dark. She was looking straight ahead, straight at the road, at whatever was coming. He had not had a partner before. He was not sure he understood what it meant. He had run the ranch for 3 years with hired hands who took his orders and left at sundown. And before that he had worked alongside his father, which was its own kind of alone. He knew cattle. He knew land. He knew the specific loneliness of waking up every morning with a weight no one else could see. He did not know this woman beside him. He knew her cooking, which was excellent, better than it had needed to be for a frontier saloon, seasoned with a precision that suggested someone who actually thought about what food should taste like rather than simply making it edible. He knew her face in the way of someone he had looked at without seeing. He knew now that she could clear a room with a single sentence and demand half of a man's life without blinking. He did not know what the wooden box contained. He didn't ask. They rode in silence for a while. The land opened up around them as they left town, flat and wide and dark. The kind of dark that only exists far from anything. Stars thick overhead, the smell of dry grass and the faint distant smell of cattle. Iron Ridge came into view around a long curve in the road. Not the house first, but the fence, the long straight line of it that his grandfather had built with cedar posts and barbed wire, and an argument with a neighboring rancher that had lasted 15 years. The fence was still good. That had always seemed important to Garrett, a sign of something, though he couldn't say of what. The house came after. 2 stories, stone on the ground floor and timber above, with a covered porch that ran the full width of the front and a chimney that needed pointing on the north side. It had been impressive once. In the moonlight, it still had the bones of impressive. Mabel slowed her horse as they came up the drive. She was looking at the house the way she had looked at Garrett in the saloon. The contractor's look. The look that went past the surface. "It's bigger than I expected," she said. "It needs work." "What doesn't?" She dismounted before he could offer help and tied her horse to the rail with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing things without assistance for a long time. Garrett opened the front door. The house smelled of emptiness, of a building that had been lived in by someone who had stopped paying attention to it. Dust on every surface. Cold hearth. The particular staleness of rooms that have been kept closed. He lit a lamp. Mabel walked in. She set her canvas bag down just inside the door, but she kept the wooden box with her. She moved through the main room, looking at things, The furniture, the shelves, the papers stacked on the table that was supposed to be a desk, but had become a place where important things went to be lost. She picked up a paper from the top of the pile, looked at it. "Is this a payment notice?" she said. "From last month." She picked up another, and another. She was reading fast, her eyes moving across the pages with the attention of someone who knew what she was looking for and was finding it. She reached the bottom of the pile. She stood there for a moment, still holding the last paper. "Garrett," she said. "Yeah. These interest calculations are wrong." He looked at her. "Wrong how?" She set the papers down carefully, in a different order than she'd found them, the beginning of a system. "Wrong in Crow's favor, consistently." She turned to look at him. In the lamplight, her face was serious and still and focused, and she looked nothing at all like the woman he had failed to see for years across a saloon counter. "Every one of these recalculates the principal to include compound interest that isn't stipulated anywhere in the original terms. Can you be sure of that without seeing the original notes?" "No," she said. "Where are the original notes?" He pulled open the desk drawer and produced a lockbox. He set it on the table, keys on the ring. She found the key and opened it. Inside were 3 documents, each folded and sealed with wax that had already been broken once. By Garrett, 3 years ago, the day he'd first tried to understand what he'd inherited. Mabel sat down at the table, moved the lamp closer, and began to read. Garrett put wood on the cold hearth and got a fire going. He filled the kettle because it seemed like the thing to do. He went to check the horses and came back. He stood in his own kitchen, which had not had a fire in it for 2 weeks because he'd been living mostly on canned food and bread from town, and he watched his wife, that word still sitting strangely in his mind, new and unbroken, like a tool he hadn't figured out how to use yet, read his father's debt contracts in the lamplight. She read for a long time. She made notes on a blank page she found in the drawer, writing in a small, precise hand with numbers arranged in columns. She crossed things out and recalculated. She turned pages back and forth, comparing language in different sections. The fire caught. The kettle began to heat. The house, which had been cold and empty and stale, began to feel, almost imperceptibly, like something else. Mabel looked up from the papers. "The debt is 1/3 of what Crow claims," she said. Garrett had been standing by the window looking out at the dark. He turned. "Say that again." "The legitimate debt, calculated at the actual agreed interest rate in these documents, is approximately 1/3 of what's on those payment notices." She held up the notes she'd made. "He's been charging triple compound on a simple interest agreement. That's not an error. It's fraud." The word landed in the room and sat there. Garrett crossed to the table and looked at her notes without touching them. He had run cattle and managed land for 12 years, and he understood money the way a working man understands it. Enough to survive on, not enough to be sophisticated about. He couldn't have found what she had found. He had looked at those papers 3 years ago and seen only the size of the numbers and the shape of his helplessness. "You're sure," he said. "I'm sure of the calculation." She tapped the original contracts. "Whether a judge will agree that the notes are clear enough to prove Crow's intent, that's different, but the numbers are the numbers." She looked up at him. "You have a case." "He's the sheriff." "He's the sheriff who has been committing financial fraud for at least 3 years, probably longer." She looked back at the papers. "And that's just the debt. There's something else in here I want to look at in the morning, when I have better light. Something about a mineral survey from 1879. There's no minerals on this land. My father had it surveyed." "Who paid for the survey?" Garrett went still. Mabel was already writing something else down. Outside, the wind moved across the open land the way it always had. The way it had when Garrett's grandfather first set a fence post and decided this was where his life would be. The ranch was quiet. The fire was going. Garrett Holloway stood in his kitchen on the night of his 30th birthday, watching a woman he had married for survival read documents in lamplight, and felt the stone in his chest shift again. Not gone, not resolved, not anything so clean as that, but moving. Something had begun tonight that neither of them could have planned. Something imperfect and uncertain and real. Mabel turned another page, made another note, and did not look up. The night stretched on around Iron Ridge, and for the first time in 3 years, Garrett didn't feel like he was facing it alone. Mabel was still at the table when the sun came up. Garrett had fallen asleep in the chair by the hearth sometime around 3 in the morning, not because he intended to, but because his body had simply stopped cooperating. He woke to gray light coming through the east window and the sound of papers being moved, and for a disoriented moment he thought he was alone the way he had always been alone, and then he remembered. She had not slept. Or if she had, she'd done it sitting up. Because when he opened his eyes, she was in the same chair at the same table with the lamp still burning, even though it was no longer needed. And she had filled both sides of 4 pages with figures and notations and something that looked like a hand-drawn map. "You should have woken me," he said. "You were more useful asleep." She said it without looking up. Not cruel, just factual. She finished writing something, set the pen down, and pushed her chair back. She had taken her hair down at some point in the night and put it back up again less precisely than before. There were ink stains on her right hand. "I found the mineral survey." Garrett stood up from the chair. His neck hurt. He'd been a rancher long enough to sleep in odd places without complaining about it, but 40 was not 30, and 30 was apparently not 28. "And?" Mabel turned one of her pages around so he could see it. She had copied a section of what appeared to be survey notation, and beside it she had written her own calculations. "Your father hired a surveyor in 1879. The report came back negative for mineral deposits. No silver, no copper, nothing worth pursuing." She tapped the copied notation. "But this notation here, this reference code, appears in a different document in the box. A correspondence between the surveyor and Silas Crow dated 3 weeks before the survey results were delivered to your father." Garrett went still. "Crow paid the surveyor," Mabel said, "or at least he wrote to him. I can't prove payment from what's here, but the survey was commissioned by your father and the surveyor was in contact with Crow before the results were given." She looked at him. "That's not normal." "No," Garrett said, "it's not. There's more." She turned another page. "The southwestern quarter of this land, the section that borders the creek, was excluded from the survey area entirely. The report says the terrain was impassable. I've ridden in this county for 4 years. That terrain isn't impassable. It's rough, not impassable." Garrett looked at her. He pulled the chair from the wall and sat down across from her at the table. "You think there's silver under that section?" "I think someone didn't want your father to know what was under that section." She folded her hands on the table. They were strong hands, marked with years of kitchen work, and they were perfectly steady. "I think Silas Crow has been running a very patient scheme. He manipulated your father's debt to make Iron Ridge appear worthless, so that when the ranch transferred, which he arranged for it to do, through that absurd will condition, he would be the only person who knew what it was actually worth." The fire in the hearth had died down to coals. The room was cool. Through the window, Garrett could see the fence line, the long cedar posts his grandfather had set, the barbed wire catching the early light. "That's a lot to build on one surveyor's letter," he said. "Yes," Mabel said. "It is." She stood up and went to the stove. She had apparently found the coffee at some point in the night, because there was a pot on the stove that was warm. She poured 2 cups without asking whether he wanted one. "So we need more." Garrett took the cup she set in front of him. "How?" "I need to see the county land records, the actual records, not the copies Crow keeps in his office." She sat back down. "There's a territorial land office in Prescott. Crow has no jurisdiction there. Whatever he's filed with the county, there should be a corresponding territorial record, and the two should match. If they don't match, then we have proof of filing fraud. We have the beginning of proof." She drank her coffee. It was strong enough to clean a saddle. "This won't be fast." "How long?" "I don't know. A week to get the records, another week to go through them properly." She paused. "And we have a more immediate problem." He waited. "Crow is going to come here today," she said. "Or he's going to send someone. Last night he lost the ranch to us, but he still holds the debt notes. He can call them due. He can try to force a sale." She set her cup down. "When he comes, we need to be ready." "Ready how?" "We need to look like we're not worried." She looked at him directly. It was still strange, the directness of it. Garrett had lived around people who softened things, who approached difficult subjects sideways. Mabel Ashcroft approached everything the way she had approached him in the saloon, straight on, no preamble. "Can you do that? Can you stand in front of Crow and look like a man who is not afraid of him?" Garrett picked up his coffee. "I've been doing it my whole life." The first visitor to Iron Ridge that morning was not Crow. It was a boy named Pete Granger, 16 years old, who worked at the livery stable and had apparently appointed himself the town's informal news delivery service. He arrived at 7 in the morning on a tired-looking pony and told Garrett at the front door that the whole town was talking about last night. "What are they saying?" Garrett asked. Pete thought about it with the earnest consideration of someone who understands the weight of accurate reporting. "Some people say you went crazy. Some people say Mabel finally went crazy. Old Mrs. Fenwick says it's romantic." He paused. "Most people say Crow's going to have you off the land by Friday." "Most people are wrong," Mabel said from behind Garrett's shoulder. Pete looked at her. "Yes, ma'am." He seemed uncertain whether to be scared of her or impressed. He settled on both. Sheriffs called a meeting at the courthouse at noon, posting it as a public land hearing. Garrett and Mabel looked at each other. "Thank you, Pete," Mabel said. "Go on back." The boy left. Garrett shut the door. "He's moving fast," Mabel said. "Told you he would." A public land hearing means he's going to try to use the debt notes in front of witnesses, make it look legal. She was already moving to the table to her papers. He'll claim the notes are due and the land should be sold to cover them. Can he do that? Not properly. Debts don't work that way. A creditor can't simply call a note due without proper notice and a legal process. She was flipping through pages. But Crow doesn't need it to be proper. He needs it to look proper, in front of enough people that no one questions it. She found what she was looking for. "We need Judge Hale." Hale retired. "He retired from the circuit. He still lives here." She looked up. "He still has authority to issue an injunction if we can show cause." Garrett was quiet for a moment. Edmund Hale was 70 years old and hadn't practiced in 2 years and had a complicated history with Silas Crow that nobody in Caldera County fully understood. Hale might not want to get involved. Then we'll give him a reason to want to. Mabel picked up 3 of her annotated pages and folded them carefully. "I'll talk to him." "You don't know him." "I've brought meals to his house when he was sick for the last 4 years. I know him better than you think." She put the folded pages into the pocket of her jacket. "You need to go to the courthouse. Go to the noon meeting. Don't say anything aggressive. Don't threaten anything. Just be present, visible. Let Crow talk and remember everything he says. And you'll be with Hale." "If I can get there and back in time, I'll be at the courthouse too." She looked at him. "If I'm not, don't agree to anything. Don't sign anything, no matter what he puts in front of you." Garrett nodded. "What if Hale won't help?" Mabel picked up her canvas bag and checked something inside it. She had repacked it at some point in the night with a different order of things, more organized than it had arrived. "Then we think of something else." "You always have a next plan?" She considered this. "I always have a next problem," she said. "Plans I make as I go." She left for town on the second horse, Garrett's Spare, a bay mare that was steady, if not fast. He watched her go down the drive and then went to the barn to start the morning work, because cattle didn't care what was happening with deeds and legal hearings, and the fence on the north end had needed attention for a week. He was mending the third post when his foreman, a taciturn man named Cal Briggs, who had worked Iron Ridge for 9 years, came out of the barn and stood watching him for a moment. "Heard you got married last night," Cal said. "Word travels." "Town's not that big." Cal pushed his hat back. He was in his mid-50s, weathered past the point of looking any particular age, with the careful eyes of someone who notices things and says very few of them. "That the Hicks cook?" "Was. She's got a new job." Cal was quiet for a long moment. "She know about the Morrison note?" Garrett looked up from the fence post. "What Morrison note?" Cal's expression shifted. Not quite uncomfortable, but the expression of a man who has just realized he is holding information that should have changed hands sooner. "Your father took out a fort 18 months before he died. Small compared to the others, $800. I only know because I drove him to the signing." He paused. "Morrison's the name on it. Caleb Morrison. He owns the feed store." "Morrison works for Crow?" "I don't know that he works for him, but they drink together." Cal looked at the fence post. $800 at whatever rate Crow's been charging would be a different number by now. Garrett stood up from the fence and looked toward the road to town. "How long have you known about this?" "Year and a half." Cal met his eyes without flinching. "I figured you knew." Garrett didn't say what he was thinking, which was that this was the problem with running things alone. Information pooled in places he didn't know to look, and by the time it surfaced, it had been sitting long enough to cause damage. I need you to write it down. Everything you remember about that day. Where you went, who was there, what your father said. You think it matters? I think everything matters now. He picked up his tools. Write it down. Bring it to the house before noon. Cal nodded. He had the manner of a man who, having made one mistake he couldn't fix, was committed to not making another. He went back toward the barn without further questions. Garrett went back to the fence post. He worked mechanically, his hands doing the known thing, while his mind ran over what Mabel had found and what Cal had just added. A fourth note, hidden in the stack of obligations, smaller than the others, which was probably why no one had flagged it. You look at a man who owes $9,000 and an extra $800 looks like noise. But it wasn't noise. It was another thread in the same net. He had underestimated Crow, not his cruelty. Garrett had always known Crow was cruel, but the patience of it, the architecture. This wasn't opportunism. This was a man who had decided what he wanted and then spent 11 years building the structure that would guarantee he got it. The question was whether he had built it well enough to be unbreakable. Mabel arrived at Judge Hale's house at 8:30. She had been to this house 40 or 50 times over 4 years, always with food. A pot of soup when Hale had his chest complaint in the winter of 1881, a pie at the holidays, a basket of bread when his housekeeper left to go take care of a sister in Flagstaff. She had never come for anything except to bring something, which she was aware created a different kind of entry than she had now. Hale answered the door himself. He was a tall man, slightly stooped in the way of tall men who have spent decades in rooms with lower ceilings than they needed. With a full white beard he kept trimmed and the habit of looking at people over whatever he was wearing on his face. Spectacles now, reading glasses before that. He looked at her over his spectacles. You married Garrett Holloway last night. I did. Come in. His study was a room that had been organized once and then lived in hard enough to undo most of the organization. Books on every surface, papers in stacks that suggested systems, but had probably outlasted the reasons for those systems. He sat in his chair behind the desk, and she sat in the chair across from it, and she told him what she had found. She did not embellish. She did not perform outrage or appeal to his sympathies. She laid out the figures, showed him the annotated pages, walked him through the survey notation and what it implied, and explained what Crow was likely to do at the noon meeting. She spoke the way she managed accounts, clearly, in sequence, with evidence before conclusion. Hale listened. He had the quality that Mabel had noticed in him from the first, the quality of actually listening, not waiting for a pause to insert his own perspective. He picked up her pages when she offered them and read them carefully. When she finished, he was quiet for almost 2 full minutes. You're asking me to issue an injunction against Silas Crow, he said. I'm asking you to look at the evidence and decide whether you think one is warranted. That's a more careful way of saying the same thing. Yes. Hale set the pages down. He turned his reading glasses in his hands. I've known Silas Crow since he was 23 years old. I hired him as a deputy. I signed his first election certificate. He paused. I've had my suspicions about him for a long time. Suspicions are not the same as evidence. No, Mabel said. They're not. That's why I'm here with evidence. What you have is suggestive. Suggestive and evidence are also not the same thing. Suggestive enough to pause a land proceeding while the evidence is completed? Hale looked at her for a long moment. You're not a lawyer. I'm not. You have a better legal mind than most lawyers I've dealt with. Mabel did not thank him for this. She waited. Hale put his glasses back on. He picked up her pages again. The survey correspondence is the strongest piece. If Crow paid that surveyor to misrepresent findings, that's criminal, not just civil. That changes the character of everything else. He turned a page. Where's the original correspondence? In the lockbox at Iron Ridge. I want to see it. You can ride out this afternoon. He almost smiled. You have a noon courthouse hearing to get to. I can manage both. He looked at her over his glasses. How long have you been doing Tom Hicks's accounts? 6 years? And before that? She had known this question would come eventually. It always came. My family had a dry goods business in Ohio. I kept the books from the time I was 14. What happened to the business? My father died. My brother took it over. She said it without particular emotion, not because the emotion wasn't there, but because she had put it somewhere it didn't interfere with necessary conversations. He ran it into the ground in 4 years. And you came west. I came west. Hale set the pages down again, decisively this time. I'll issue a temporary injunction against the transfer of any Iron Ridge property pending review of the debt instruments. That gives you 30 days. He picked up a pen. That's the most I can do without a formal hearing, and a formal hearing requires more than what you've brought me this morning, however impressive what you've brought me is. 30 days is enough to get the territorial records from Prescott. 30 days is enough if you work every one of them. He started writing. Tell your husband to come see me this afternoon. I'll want his signature on the injunction application. Mabel stood, picked up her bag. Thank you. Don't thank me. If I'm wrong about Crow, this is going to be a very unpleasant 30 days for both of you. He kept writing. And if I'm right about him, it may be unpleasant anyway. She was back on the road to the courthouse by 9:30, which gave her 2 hours before the meeting. Enough time if nothing went wrong. Something went wrong. Caleb Morrison was waiting at the edge of the road about a mile outside of town. He was on a gray horse that was too fine for a feed store owner, which told her something, and he had a young man with him who had the particular expression of someone hired to stand near things and look large. Morrison himself was in his 40s, clean-shaven, with the careful dress of a man who wanted to be taken seriously and had spent money trying to achieve that end. He held up a hand when he saw her coming. Mrs. Holloway. She slowed the mare but didn't stop. Mr. Morrison, I'm in a hurry. This won't take long. He pulled his horse alongside hers, not blocking her, not quite, but creating a situation where stopping was easier than proceeding. I understand you spent the night going through the Holloway debt instruments. She looked at him. Word really does travel fast in this county. I hold a note on Iron Ridge, $800, signed by Douglas Holloway in February of 1882. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. I'm calling it due. Mabel looked at the document without taking it. On what grounds? Change of ownership. The note has a clause. Let me see the clause. He held it out. She took it and read it. She read fast, always had, a skill her father had drilled into her on the principle that a page not read is a trap not seen. The clause was there. Change of title or ownership triggers immediate payment in full. It was clean, well-written, and it had been added at the bottom of the original note in handwriting that was slightly smaller than the rest of the document. This is a different hand, she said. Excuse me? The clause. The handwriting is different from the rest of the note. She folded it and held it back out to him. Someone added it after the fact. Morrison's face did something complicated. That's a serious accusation. It's an observation. She handed him the document. We'll have it examined. If the ink age is consistent with the rest of the note, we'll discuss it. If it isn't, she gathered her reins. Get out of my way, Mr. Morrison. He didn't move immediately. The large young man watched with professional blankness. Mrs. Holloway, Morrison said, you don't understand the position you're in. I understand it better than you think. She looked at him steadily. I know about the meeting at noon. I know Crow sent you here to delay me. I know the note is probably fraudulent, and I know you know it too because you're a man who wants to be taken seriously, and what you're doing right now is the opposite of serious. She let that sit for a moment. Move. Morrison moved. She rode past him without looking back. Behind her, she heard him say something to the young man in a low voice, but she didn't catch the words and didn't try to. Her hands were not quite steady on the reins. She gripped them tighter and kept her spine straight and looked at the road ahead. She was not going to give either of them the satisfaction of seeing her rattle, but she was rattled. She was honest enough with herself to admit it. The added clause was a new piece of information she hadn't accounted for. If Crow had people willing to alter legal documents, and he apparently did, then the fraudulent ledger entries she had found might be the smallest part of what he had constructed. The question was how deep it went. The question was whether the original debt instruments in the lockbox at Iron Ridge were themselves untampered, or whether she had spent all night analyzing documents that had already been quietly rewritten. She needed a document examiner. She needed the Prescott territorial records. She needed 30 days and a lawyer and probably a federal marshal. And what she had was one retired judge's injunction and whatever was in her own head. She reached town at 10 past 10, tied the mare behind the saloon out of habit, and went inside to find Garrett. He was already there, sitting at a corner table with Cal Briggs across from him, and a piece of paper between them. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, more like the expression of a man who has been doing arithmetic alone and just found someone who can check his work. She sat down. She told him about Hale, about the injunction, about Morrison on the road. She watched his face while she talked. Not to read his emotions, she had enough of her own to manage, but to see how he processed bad news. A man who falls apart when things go wrong was a different problem than the one she already had. He didn't fall apart. His jaw tightened on the Morrison part, and he looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked back at her. The clause is forged? Almost certainly. The handwriting is a different size. A document examiner could confirm it. She paused. We need one of those. Prescott? Prescott. She looked at Cal's paper. What's this? Cal slid it toward her. His written account of the day he had driven Douglas Holloway to sign the Morrison note. Who was in the room, what was said, whether anyone had left the room with the document before Douglas signed. Mabel read it twice. Cal had a good memory and wrote in plain language without embellishment, which made it more useful, not less. You were there when he signed, she said to Cal. Stood outside, but I saw the document before they went in, and after. He pointed to a line in his account. Morrison asked me to wait in the hall. When they came out, the document was different. Mabel looked up sharply. Different how? Folded different. I noticed because Douglas had trouble folding things by then. His hands were bad. When we went in, it was folded in thirds. When they came out, it was folded in quarters. She looked at him for a long moment. You'd testify to that? Cal looked at the table. He was a quiet man who had worked this land for 9 years and had stayed quiet about things he should have said sooner, and he knew it. Yes, he said. Mabel folded his written account and put it with her other papers. Don't go anywhere until after the meeting. The courthouse at noon was not what Garrett had expected. He had expected a small procedural thing, Crow going through motions, some paperwork, a declaration of intent. What he found was a room with 40 people in it, which meant Crow had spent the morning getting every landowner and businessman in Caldera County into a single room. That was deliberate. That was Crow understanding that 40 witnesses to a legal proceeding were harder to challenge than 4. Crow stood at the front of the room in his sheriff's uniform, which he wore with the ease of a man who understood that clothes were a kind of argument. He had the 3 debt instruments on the table in front of him, and beside them a document that Garrett recognized as a notice of sale. Prepared already. Printed. He had not expected them to be there. Garrett saw it in the half-second adjustment of Crow's expression when Garrett and Mabel walked in together. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. The addition of a variable he had assumed he'd neutralized. Mabel sat in the second row. She had her papers in her lap and her hands folded over them, and she looked like a woman who had come to a community meeting and found a seat. Entirely ordinary, entirely calm. Crow started talking. He talked about responsible land stewardship. He talked about the economic health of Caldera County. He talked about the unfortunate circumstances of the Holloway estate and the regrettable necessity of resolving outstanding obligations. He never used the word fraud. He never raised his voice. He was very good at this. The man had been doing it for years, Mabel thought, framing theft in the language of civic duty. When he finally got to the debt instruments, he laid them out with the care of a man presenting evidence he expects to be accepted without examination. The total outstanding obligation against Iron Ridge, Crow said, currently stands at... Those figures are incorrect. Mabel's voice was not loud. It was the same voice she had used in the saloon, calibrated to be heard clearly without performance. 40 people turned to look at her. Crow looked at her. Mrs. Holloway, the calculation of interest on these notes doesn't accord with the agreed terms. She stood up. She held up her annotated pages. I've done the calculation. At the actual contracted rate, the outstanding obligation is approximately $11,000, not $32,000. The difference, she looked at the room, not at Crow, is the result of interest being calculated in a manner not specified in the original agreements. That's fraud. The room erupted. Crow raised his voice over the noise. This woman has no legal standing. She's a party to the Iron Ridge deed, Judge Hale said. The room quieted. Nobody had noticed Hale come in. He was in the back, near the door, standing with the particular stillness of a man who has been in enough courtrooms to know that stillness is its own kind of authority. "Edmund," Crow said, and something changed in his voice. A careful quality. "This isn't a judicial proceeding." "No, it isn't." Hale walked to the front of the room at the unhurried pace of a man who has nowhere more important to be, which means it has no authority to transfer property or adjudicate debt. "Whatever you've arranged here, Silas, it's a meeting. Nothing that happens in it is legally binding." He turned to the room. "I've issued a temporary injunction this morning preventing any transfer of Iron Ridge property for 30 days pending examination of the debt instruments." He looked at Crow. "If you'd like to challenge that injunction, you're welcome to file in territorial court, in Prescott." The room was very quiet. Crow looked at Hale, he looked at Mabel, he looked at Garrett, who had not said a single word, and who had been watching every person in the room the way a man watches a range fire, tracking the wind, calculating the direction. "This isn't over," Crow said. He said it quietly, the way he had said it the night before. But there was something different in it now. The night before it had been a statement of confidence. Now it was something more effortful. "No," Mabel said. "It isn't." The room began to move, people getting up, the noise of 40 conversations starting at once. Garrett came to stand beside Mabel, not in front of her, not in the protective way she would have resented, but beside, equal height, equal ground. Hale reached them. He looked at Mabel's pages, which she had not put away. "The survey correspondence," he said quietly. "I need to see it today." "You can ride out with us after this," Mabel said. Hale nodded. He started to turn away and then stopped. "You did well," he said. "Both of you." Garrett watched him go, and then looked at Mabel. "That went better than I expected." "It went better than Crow expected," she said. "That's what matters." She put her papers back in order. Her hands were steadier now than they'd been on the road back from Morrison's. "He's going to change tactics." "What do you think he'll try next?" She looked at the front of the room, where Crow was talking quietly to two men Garrett didn't recognize. Not local, well-dressed, the type of men who traveled with other people's money and made decisions with it. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's what worries me." They rode back to Iron Ridge that afternoon with Hale, who examined the survey correspondence in the lockbox for 45 minutes, and then sat back in his chair with an expression that mixed satisfaction and grimness in roughly equal parts. "He paid the surveyor," Hale said. "I'm certain of it. The notation cross-references a payment ledger that I recognize. It's the County General Fund format from 1879. Crow had access to that fund as deputy sheriff." He closed the lockbox. "This is enough to write to the territorial attorney general." "How long does that take?" Garrett said. "Weeks, possibly longer." Hale looked at them both. "In the meantime, you need to be careful." "We're being careful," Mabel said. "I mean, physically careful." Hale's voice was quiet and very direct. "Silas Crow has never had anyone put this much pressure on what he's built. I don't know what he does when his back is against the wall, because his back has never been against a wall before." He stood up. "Lock that box and keep it somewhere other than this house." After Hale left, Mabel took the lockbox to the barn and buried it in the grain store under 40 pounds of oats. Not because it was a perfect hiding place. It wasn't. But because it was a better one than the desk drawer, and because doing something was better than standing still. Garrett was at the fence rail when she came back. The same fence rail where he had stood 3 years ago, watching the sun go down with a stone in his chest. He wasn't watching the sun now. It was mid-afternoon, still bright. He was looking at the southwestern quarter of the property, the section the survey had skipped. She stood beside him. "What do you think is down there?" he said. "Silver, most likely. The geological formation is consistent with what they found at the Montoya claim in '79, and that's 15 miles south of here." She looked at the land. It was rough country, as she'd told Hale, gullied and rocky, harder to run cattle on, easier to ignore. Could be significant, could be enough to change everything. Or it could be nothing. "It could be nothing," she agreed. But Crow didn't go to 11 years of trouble for nothing. Garrett was quiet. Then, "You buried the lockbox in the grain store." "Under the oats." He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, but she caught it. Smart. It's a temporary solution. Most solutions are. He turned away from the fence. The afternoon was cooling, the light going golden. I need to check the north pasture before dark. You should eat something. I don't think you've eaten since yesterday. He was right, and she was faintly annoyed that he'd noticed. There's bread in the kitchen. There's also eggs, if someone feeds the chickens. She looked at him. I have chickens, he said. He sounded mildly defensive about it. She went to feed the chickens, which she hadn't known he had, and found 4 of them in a coop behind the outbuilding that was in slightly better repair than everything else on the property, which told her that Garrett Holloway, who had been living alone for 3 years on canned food and frontier stoicism, had kept 4 chickens going through sheer consistency of care. People were sometimes different from what they appeared. She had known that for a long time. It still surprised her when she encountered it. She fed the chickens and collected 2 eggs and went inside to make something resembling a meal. And she thought about Crow's 2 well-dressed strangers, and about Morrison on the road, and about the 4th note with its forged claws. And she thought, 30 days. 30 days to build something strong enough to bring down 11 years of careful architecture. She cracked an egg into the pan. She had worked with less before. The letter to the Territorial Attorney General went out on a Thursday, carried by Cal Briggs personally to the Prescott stage because Mabel didn't trust the Caldera County postal system, which ran through a building 2 doors down from Crow's office. That had been 6 days ago. In those 6 days, 3 things had happened that Mabel had expected, and 2 that she hadn't. The 3 expected things. Crow had Caleb Morrison file a formal debt claim through the county recorder's office, naming Iron Ridge as collateral. Crow had also quietly let it be known around town that the Holloway situation was a legal dispute best avoided by anyone with business interests in the county. The frontier version of a warning shot, delivered through canceled supply orders and a feed merchant who suddenly couldn't accommodate Iron Ridge's account. And Crow had stationed one of his deputies, a young man named Wes Tully, on the main road past the ranch at irregular hours, not doing anything, just being visible. The 2 unexpected things. Tom Hicks had come to the ranch on the 4th day, hat in hand, to tell Mabel he was sorry for not paying her better and to ask if she'd consider keeping the saloon accounts on a consulting basis. She had looked at him for a long moment and said she'd think about it. She hadn't decided yet. The other unexpected thing was that 3 ranch families from the eastern end of the county, the Delgados, the Parishes, and an older widow named Ruth Calhoun, who ran 50 head of cattle alone, had ridden out to Iron Ridge separately, on separate days, to tell Garrett that Crow had done the same thing to them. Different structures, different amounts, different timelines, but the same architecture. The same pattern of inflated debt and manipulated surveys and documents with clauses that hadn't been there at signing. Mabel had interviewed all 3 families. She had written everything down. What she was building now, spread across the table in the Iron Ridge main room on a Wednesday evening, was not just a defense of one ranch. It was the outline of a criminal enterprise that had been running for over a decade. How many properties total? Garrett said. He was sitting across from her ago, when it became clear that his help consisted of moving things from one pile to another without understanding the system. He had made coffee instead, which was more useful. 7 that I can confirm, Mabel said without looking up. Possibly 9. Ruth Calhoun mentioned a man named Aldridge who sold his property to the county land authority 3 years ago and left the territory entirely. If Aldridge's debt was manufactured the same way ours was, then Crow already completed the cycle on at least 1 property. Yes. She turned a page. And he kept it. Garrett was quiet for a moment. How much is the southwestern quarter worth? If we're right about the silver. Conservatively, based on the Montoya claim numbers and adjusting for vein depth, somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000. She said it the way she said most things, without drama, as though the number were simply a number. At high estimate, more. Garrett picked up his coffee cup. He set it back down without drinking. That's why he waited 11 years. That's why he was patient. She finally looked up. A man who wants someone's cattle operation is not patient for 11 years. A man who knows there's $100,000 under someone's land and needs to make sure the owner never finds out. That man is patient for as long as it takes. Outside, the wind had been building since sundown. It wasn't unusual for the territory. Late-season winds that came off the high country and pushed hard across the flats. But there was something different in the sound of it tonight, something with more weight than usual, and Garrett had noticed it the way a rancher notices atmospheric things, below the level of active thought. He went to the window. The barn was dark, which it should be. The fence line was as it should be. The road was empty. Tully's pattern had him somewhere else at this hour. Nothing wrong, just wind. He came back to the table. "I need to go to Prescott," he said. Mabel looked at him. They'd been circling this for 3 days. "The Attorney General's office hasn't responded to the letter," he said. "It's been 6 days. Either they didn't get it, or they got it, and they're waiting for more before they act, or they got it, and they're deciding how to handle the fact that the problem is a county sheriff with enough local influence to make a federal inquiry uncomfortable." He sat down. "I need to go there in person. Show them what you found. Make them move." "If you leave the ranch, I know." Mabel pressed her lips together. She looked at the table, at 7 families' worth of documented fraud laid out in her careful columns. "If you're in Prescott and Crow decides to move on the injunction, you'd be here alone. I'm aware of that. Cal would be here." "Cal is one man." Garrett leaned forward, his forearms on the table. "What's the alternative? Wait for the Attorney General to respond on his own schedule while Crow spends those weeks tightening everything? He's already cutting off our supply lines. He's already got someone watching the road. In another 2 weeks, we won't be able to get feed for the cattle, and without the cattle, this whole argument about silver doesn't matter because we'll have nothing to hold with anyway." Mabel looked at him. He was right, and she knew he was right, which made it more difficult rather than less, because she also knew that his going to Prescott was exactly the kind of move Crow would have anticipated. A man who had spent 11 years planning did not fail to plan for the moment when his target tried to get federal attention. "How long?" she said. 4 days if I ride hard, 3 if I push the horse. Push the horse." She turned back to her papers. "I'll put together everything you need to take. Copies of everything. Originals stay here." "I'll leave before dawn." She nodded. Her pen was already moving. Garrett watched her for a moment. He had been watching her for 10 days now, and he still hadn't found the bottom of her. She had been a cook in a saloon for 11 years, and she had, as far as he could tell, been preparing for something the entire time, sharpening herself against other people's problems, learning the shape of money and law and fraud from the inside of a business that ran on all 3. He wondered sometimes what she had been like at 14, keeping the books for a dry goods store in Ohio. He suspected she had been formidable in a way that nobody around her had known what to do with. He was starting to understand why she'd stayed invisible for so long. Being seen was dangerous when the people doing the seeing didn't have the language for what they were looking at. He went to the barn to check on the horses. He wanted to make sure the gray was in good condition for the ride. The bay had thrown a shoe 2 days ago, and the replacement wasn't settled yet. He was in the barn, running his hand down the gray's foreleg, when he heard it. Not the wind. Something below the wind. A particular sound that a man who has lived on open land knows before he consciously identifies it. The sound of horses moving slowly, off the road, trying to be quiet. Garrett straightened. He stood very still in the dark of the barn, and he listened and he counted. 3 horses, maybe 4, moving through the dry grass at the south end of the property. Not coming from the road. Coming from the open land to the south. From the direction that didn't have a trail. From the direction a man would come from if he wanted to approach the ranch without being seen from the main road where his own deputy was theoretically stationed. Garrett moved to the barn door without lighting a lamp. He looked toward the house. The window he could see from here was the main room window. Mabel's lamp was visible through it, the steady yellow light of someone working. He looked toward the south. He couldn't see anyone yet, but he could still hear them, clearer now, and he caught a smell on the wind that made his stomach drop. Coal oil. He ran. He covered the distance between the barn and the house in the dark at a flat run, and he hit the front door hard, and Mabel was on her feet before he finished opening it, papers scattering, hand already reaching for the drawer where she'd started keeping the pistol she'd brought in the canvas bag. "South side," he said. 4 men. Coal oil. Her face went absolutely white and then absolutely still. "How long?" "Minutes, maybe less." She grabbed the papers from the table, not all of them, the most critical ones. The originals they were supposed to leave here while he took copies to Prescott, because everything had just changed about what needed to be preserved. She had them folded inside her jacket in 10 seconds. "Back door," Garrett said. "The lockbox. Leave it. Go." She went. He was right behind her, and he pulled the back door shut as the first sound hit the side of the house. Not an explosion, not a crash, just a quiet, almost gentle sound, the sound of liquid being poured against dry timber, which was somehow worse than a crash because of how deliberate it was. They came around the north side of the house in the dark, and Garrett pulled Mabel flat against the wall before she could take another step. Through the gap between the house and the woodshed, he could see two of them, men in dark coats, faces covered with cloth, one holding a lamp with the chimney off. The lamp touched the coal oil. The south side of the house went up with a sound that was not quite an explosion and not quite a roar, but something between the two, a deep whomp of ignition that lit the whole yard orange. Garrett felt the heat of it from 30 feet away, and he pulled Mabel further north toward the barn. "The horses," she said. "I know." They got to the barn. The horses were already agitated, moving in their stalls, the gray throwing his head and the bay stamping. Garrett got them bridled, no time for saddles, and opened the stall doors, and they came out hard, both of them, and he caught the gray's mane and Mabel caught the bay's, and they went out the back of the barn on the north side, away from the fire, away from the men. Behind them, the house was fully burning now. Garrett could hear it without looking. That particular voice a building has when the fire has gotten inside the walls and found the roof. They rode north into the dark without speaking. The bay didn't like carrying a rider without a saddle and moved in a choppy, unhappy way that Mabel corrected through leg pressure alone, which meant she had spent time on horses without saddles, which was the kind of information Garrett filed away for a different moment. He got them half a mile out before he pulled up. "You're not hurt," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "No." She was breathing hard, not from exertion. "You?" "No." He turned to look back. The fire was visible from here, a bright orange wound in the dark, the shape of the house visible inside it like a skeleton. The main house, the stone and timber structure his grandfather had built, that his father had added to, that he had been maintaining by himself for 3 years. It was going to be gone by morning. He looked at it for a long time. Mabel was looking at him, not at the fire. "I know every one of them," he said. She looked at him. "I saw their boots. 2 of them." He turned away from the fire. "Tully, the deputy, and a man named Rance Decker who works the stockyard. I've known Rance Decker since I was 12 years old." Mabel was quiet for a moment. "You're certain?" "I'm certain." She nodded once. She reached inside her jacket and checked the papers were still there. They were. "Where can we go tonight?" "Ruth Calhoun's place. It's 8 miles. She'll take us in. Then we ride." She pressed her heel to the bay's side. "And in the morning, you leave for Prescott." "The plan hasn't changed?" "The plan has changed considerably," Mabel said. "Arson is a federal crime. Attempted murder is a federal crime. Crow just handed us something worth more than everything we had on that table." She was already moving. "Ride, Garrett." Ruth Calhoun opened her door at 2 in the morning without a lamp. She'd heard the horses on her drive and was already standing in the dark of her doorway with a shotgun when they came up, which told everything necessary about how a woman who ran 50 head of cattle alone had survived this long in Caldera County. She looked at them. She looked at the faint orange glow on the southern horizon. "Iron Ridge?" she said. "Yes," Garrett said. She stood aside. "Come in." Ruth Calhoun was 61 years old, had buried a husband and 2 sons, and ran her place with a stripped-down efficiency that left no room for anything unnecessary, including sentiment about bad news. She put coffee on, put blankets out, and sat at her kitchen table across from Mabel without any of the social preamble that might have preceded such a conversation between 2 women who barely knew each other. "Tell me what you need," she said. Mabel told her. She was concise, organized even at 2 in the morning after running from a burning house. She laid out what they had, what Garrett was going to Prescott for, and what she needed Ruth to do while he was gone. Ruth listened. "You want to stay here? If you'll have us. I don't think Crow will move on your property. Not yet. He's already too exposed. And I need a base to work from." "What work?" "The other families. Delgado, Parrish, the others you know of." Mabel looked at her steadily. "I need their documentation. Everything they have. Original notes, payment receipts, correspondence. I need to build the full picture while Garrett is getting federal attention." She paused. "And I need you to help me get to those families without being seen on the main roads." Ruth turned her coffee cup in her hands. She was a woman who had been quiet for a long time about things that deserved to be loud, and she seemed to be deciding something. Not whether to trust Mabel, but whether she was willing to accept what helping would cost her. Crow foreclosed on my neighbor Henry Aldridge, she said, 3 years ago. Henry's wife had a baby coming, and Henry couldn't fight it, so he left. She looked at the table. I should have said something then. You're saying something now, Mabel said. Ruth looked at her. Then she nodded. I know 3 trails that don't cross a main road between here and the parish place. I know 2 more that get to Delgado. She finished her coffee. Get some sleep. We start at first light. Garrett left before dawn with copies of everything. The gray horse with a full canteen and 4 days of hard riding ahead, and very few words. He was not a man who was good at departures. He stood at Ruth's fence for a moment and looked at Mabel, and she could see him working through something. Not doubt about going, he'd already resolved that, but something less nameable. If something happens before I get back, he started, I know what to do. I know you do. He was quiet for a moment. That's not what I was going to say. She waited. What I was going to say was, he stopped again. He was looking at her with the direct, uncomfortable gaze of a man trying to say something true that he didn't have practice saying. You didn't have to do any of this. Last night, the papers staying, you didn't have to. We had an agreement. You could have left when the house caught. You could have ridden the other direction. His jaw tightened. You stayed. Mabel looked at him for a moment. Go to Prescott, she said. Come back with federal marshals. Something moved in his face. Yes, ma'am, he said, and he rode. She watched him go until he was out of sight, and then she went inside to start working. The next 4 days were the hardest she had managed, and she had managed hard days before. Ruth Calhoun was good on her word about the trails. They rode out the first morning before full light, through country that was rockier and more demanding than the main roads but invisible from any vantage Crow's people would use, and they reached the Parrish ranch by mid-morning. Tom Parrish was a heavy-set man in his 40s who had been fighting Crow's debt claims for 2 years without understanding what he was fighting. He had 2 filing cabinets of documents he'd been too overwhelmed to organize. Mabel spent 3 hours at his kitchen table going through them and found 4 instances of the same interest calculation fraud she'd identified in the Holloway notes, plus a boundary survey that had been amended after filing to shift 14 acres of parish land into the county general territory. That was new. That was Crow not just inflating debt, but quietly moving boundary lines. She wrote it all down. She took careful copies of the key documents, with Tom Parrish signing each copy as a true representation of the original, which gave the copies evidentiary weight. Delgado the next day. 2 more families the day after that, through trails that took them over ground so rough that Mabel's back ached for hours, and the bay horse developed an opinion about rocky switchbacks that she had to argue with repeatedly. Each family had a version of the same story, different details, different years, but the same underlying structure. A county official with a badge and patience, and a very precise understanding of how to make fraud look like bad luck. On the 4th night, back at Ruth's, Mabel sat at the kitchen table and looked at what she had assembled and understood that it was the most important thing she had ever done, not the most difficult. Difficult was relative, and she'd had difficult in Ohio, and difficult on the frontier, and difficult in a saloon kitchen when the money wasn't adding up, and she'd had to make it add up anyway. But this was the most important. This was 11 years of one man's greed laid out in columns and dates and forged signatures, and there was enough here, she was reasonably certain, to put Silas Crow in a federal prison. She was also reasonably certain he knew it. The deputy, Wes Tully, had been seen on the road past Ruth's property twice in the last 2 days. Not stopping, just passing, looking. Crow knew she was here, he probably knew what she was doing, and he was calculating she could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. Whether and when to move. The variable was Garrett. If he had reached Prescott and the Attorney General had responded, there might already be federal machinery moving toward Caldera County, and Crow would know that moving against Mabel now would accelerate exactly the outcome he was trying to prevent. If Garrett hadn't gotten there yet, or if the Attorney General was slow to act, Ruth came into the kitchen at 11 that night and found Mabel still at the table. "You need to sleep," Ruth said. "I know." Knowing and doing are different things. Ruth sat down across from her. She had the manner of a woman who did not dispense comfort often, but knew where it was kept when it was needed. "He'll be back." "I'm not worried about that." "Then what?" Mabel looked at the papers. "I'm worried about the timing. If Crow moves before Garrett comes back with federal authority—" She stopped. "Then we deal with it," Ruth said simply. Mabel looked at her. "I didn't survive 30 years out here by assuming things would go right," Ruth said. "I survived by knowing what I'd do when they went wrong." She looked at the papers on the table. "What do you need if it goes wrong?" Mabel was quiet for a moment. "I need those documents to reach federal hands, even if I can't deliver them myself." She looked at Ruth. "If something happens to me, it won't. If it does, who's the most reliable person you know in this county who isn't afraid of Crow?" Ruth didn't hesitate. "Edmund Hale." "I need a packet delivered to Hale with instructions to forward it to the Territorial Attorney General by name. I have the name from the letter Cal sent. Not the county postal system. Directly." Ruth nodded. "I'll put Pete Granger on a horse. That boy will ride to the moon if you ask him right." Mabel almost smiled. "Get him ready." She went to sleep at midnight. She woke at 4. Not because of a sound exactly. More like the absence of sound. The particular silence that settles after something has moved through it. She lay still for a moment, listening, and then she heard it. Horses. Multiple. Not on the trail. On the main road coming from the direction of town, moving without particular stealth, which was worse than if they'd been trying to be quiet. Men who move without stealth have already decided they don't need to be. She was up and dressed in under a minute. She took the papers, the pistol, her jacket. She went to Ruth's door and knocked twice, the signal they'd agreed on, and heard Ruth moving immediately, which meant Ruth hadn't been sleeping either. Through the window she saw them. 6 men on the road, slowing as they reached Ruth's gate. In the front, unhurried, straight in the saddle, was Silas Crow. He was not wearing his deputy on his left side tonight. He was wearing Rance Decker, the man from the stockyard, one of the 2 Garrett had identified as having been at the fire. Decker had the look of a man who had done things he was fine with having done. Mabel counted. 6 men, Crow in the middle, 3 on his right, 2 on his left, including Decker. All of them armed in the obvious way of men who expected to need to be. Ruth appeared at her shoulder with the shotgun. "How many?" "6. Ruth looked. Her face went tight and then went still in the way of a woman who has made peace with the worst possibilities of her situation and knows how to function inside them. "I can cover the gate." "Don't fire unless they come through it." Mabel tucked the papers inside her jacket. "I'm going to talk to him." "Mabel, he needs something from me. He wouldn't be here himself if he didn't need something." She checked the pistol. Loaded, she'd been keeping it loaded, which was a new habit of the last 10 days. She put it in her pocket. "If I'm wrong, shoot him." She went out the front door before she could think herself out of it. The air outside was cold and the sky was starting to lighten in the east, that particular gray that comes before any color does, and the 6 men at the gate looked like a painting of something ominous. Crow sat on a dark horse with his hands resting on the pommel, and when he saw Mabel come out of the house alone, he tilted his head slightly, the adjustment of a man reassessing. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "You're on private property," she said. She stopped at the fence, not the gate, 10 feet from him. "It's not locked." "Doesn't matter. You haven't been invited." Crow looked past her at the house. Looking for Garrett, she understood, trying to determine whether Garrett was inside or gone. "Your husband's not here," she said. He looked back at her. "Where is he?" "That's not your business." "I think it is." He said it pleasantly. He had a gift for pleasantness that she found more unnerving than anger. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm going to be direct with you. Whatever you think you've assembled, documents, testimony, surveys, it's not as solid as you believe. Witnesses recant, papers get lost, judges retire." He let that sit for a moment. "Iron Ridge burned. That's unfortunate. But the rest of this," he made a gesture with one hand, a small dismissive sweep, "can stop being unpleasant for everyone involved, including you." "What exactly are you offering?" "Walk away. Both of you. I'll clear the debt. All of it. Legitimate or otherwise. You get 6 months to relocate, whatever personal property survived the fire, and my word that this ends here." Mabel looked at him. The sky was getting lighter. She could see his face more clearly now. Not the performance of pleasantness, but underneath it, the thing that lived there. Not rage. Something more controlled than rage. The focused patience of a man who had always found a way to get what he wanted and was simply identifying, calmly, which way that would be this time. "You burned our house," she said. "I don't know what you're referring to." "I know the men who did it. I have names." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear. She didn't think Crow experienced fear in the ordinary way, but a recalibration. He was deciding how much she actually had and how much was a position. "You have paper," he said. "Paper burns." "I know." She kept her voice flat. "I've made copies. Copies aren't originals. They are when they're signed and witnessed by the parties involved." She tilted her head. "How many ranch families do you think I've spoken to in the last 4 days, Sheriff? How many of them signed copies of their own documents? How many of them have decided they're done being quiet?" Crow was still for a moment, truly still, the first time she had seen him without the controlled performance of ease. "This doesn't end well for you," he said. "Maybe not." She looked at him. "But it ends worse for you." Behind Crow, Rance Decker shifted in his saddle and his hand moved toward his side, not quite reaching it but making the intention clear. Mabel took the pistol out of her pocket. She did it without speed, without drama, the way you take a tool out of a pocket when you need to use it. She held it at her side. "Decker," she said, if your hand goes any further, Mrs. Calhoun is going to put a hole in you from that window. She's been hunting in this county for 30 years, and she is not going to miss at this distance." She glanced at Crow. "That goes for everyone at this gate. I've got your names. I've got your boots from the night of the fire. I've got signed testimony from 5 ranch families and a retired judge who has already written to the Territorial Attorney General." She let that sit. "You want to make this worse? Come through that gate." Nobody came through the gate. Crow looked at her for a long time. There was something in his face that she recognized with a start. It was the same thing she'd seen in the faces of men who had underestimated her before. Not quite contempt and not quite surprise. The particular expression of someone confronting the fact that what they were looking at is not what they had assumed they were looking at. "You're going to want to think carefully about the next few weeks," he said. His voice had gone quieter. Less performance, more something else. "I've been thinking carefully about the next few weeks for 10 days, Mabel said. "Have you?" He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned his horse without a word, and the men behind him turned with him, and they rode back up the road toward town. Mabel watched them go. She kept her spine straight and the pistol in her hand until they were out of sight around the curve, and then she exhaled, and she found that her hands were shaking and her knees were not entirely steady, and her heart was doing something complicated in her chest. Ruth was at the door. "You all right?" "Fine." She wasn't, quite, but she would be. "Get Pete Granger." "Already sent for him." Mabel looked at the road. The dust from Crow's horses was still settling. He would come back. She knew that. What she'd done at that gate had bought time and demonstrated position. But Crow was a man who played long games, and he had not conceded anything. He had retreated. There was a difference. He was going to recalculate, reassess, find the angle she hadn't covered. And Garrett wasn't back yet. She went inside and sat down at Ruth's kitchen table, and she looked at the document she was still holding pressed against her jacket, and she thought, hold on, that was all. Just hold on until the machinery started moving. She had done harder things than hold on. She told herself that and mostly believed it. Outside, the sun came up over Caldera County the way it always had. Indifferent to human arrangements, warming the same land regardless of who claimed to own it, the fence posts. Garrett's grandfather had set 50 years ago, caught the early light, and cast their long shadows westward. And somewhere on the Prescott Road, a man on a gray horse was riding hard, carrying everything she'd built toward the only outcome that would make any of this mean what it needed to mean. She picked up her pen and kept working. Garrett came back on the 5th day, not the 4th. He came back with 6 men he hadn't left with. Mabel heard the horses from inside Ruth's house mid-morning and was at the window before anyone else moved, her hand already at her pocket, and then she saw the gray horse and let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest for 5 days doing damage. She went outside. She didn't run. She walked, which was harder. Garrett swung down from the gray, and he looked like a man who had ridden hard for 5 days, dust in every crease, eyes reddened, a 2-week beard that was closer to 3 now. and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he wasn't certain he'd see again and is adjusting to the reality of seeing. "You're all right," he said. It wasn't a question. He was confirming it. "I'm all right." She looked at the 6 men behind him, 3 in the plain dark coats of federal marshals, badges visible, and 3 others in territorial government dress, one of whom was carrying a leather document case that had the particular weight of official authority. "You did it. You did it," he said. "I just delivered the evidence." He introduced her to the man with the document case, Deputy Attorney General Thomas Rourke, 40-something, compact and precise in his movements, with the practiced neutrality of a man who had navigated politically complicated situations before and understood that the first thing you do in one is get the facts straight before you do anything else. Rourke shook her hand and looked at her the way Hale had looked at her annotated pages, with the attention of someone who recognized what they were dealing with. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "your husband tells me you've assembled documentation across 7 properties. 8, as of 2 days ago. I found a 9th family, but their records were destroyed when they left the territory. I have their signed affidavit." Rourke opened his document case. "I'd like to see everything you have." They sat at Ruth's kitchen table for 2 hours, Ruth herself making coffee and staying in the background with the tact of a woman who understood when her role was to provide the room rather than participate in what happened in it. Mabel walked Rourke and his assistant through the full picture: the Holloway debt fraud, the surveyor correspondence, the boundary line manipulation on the parish property, Cal Briggs's testimony about the Morrison note alteration, the signed affidavits from all 8 families, and the arson. When she got to the arson, Rourke stopped her. "You have positive identification of 2 participants," he said. "Wes Tully, currently serving as a Caldera County deputy, and Rance Decker, who works at the county stockyard." She set down Cal's written account and her own notes from the night of the fire. "My husband identified both by their boots and build. He's known both men for years." "That's circumstantial." "In isolation? Yes. Combined with Decker's prior association with Crow, Tully's employment record, and the testimony of 3 neighbors who saw both men leaving town together that evening." She slid another paper across. "Ruth Calhoun confirmed she saw Tully's horse at the south end of her property the same night, heading in the direction of Iron Ridge. She's prepared to testify." Rourke read the page. His assistant was taking notes rapidly. "You've been busy," Rourke said, without quite making it a compliment or quite not making it one. "I had time," Mabel said. Rourke looked at her for a moment, and then at Garrett, who had been sitting beside her throughout in the way he'd been standing at the courthouse, present, visible, not performing anything. "Your husband said the same thing about you, word for word." Garrett said nothing. He was drinking his 3rd cup of coffee and watching Rourke with the patient, assessing attention he'd been giving people since the night at the saloon. He had stopped being surprised by Mabel, Rourke noticed, which told its own story. "Here's where we are," Rourke said. He folded his hands on the table. "I have enough to arrest Silas Crow on federal fraud charges. The survey manipulation alone, paying a county surveyor with public funds to misrepresent mineral findings. That's both fraud and corruption of a public official, both federal offenses. The debt instrument alteration is fraud on its face." He paused. "The arson is state level, not federal, but it becomes federal when it's used to obstruct federal proceedings, which I'm going to argue it was." He looked at them both. "What I don't have is a certainty about how Crow responds to arrest. In my experience, men who've spent 11 years building something tend to have thought about what they do if it comes apart." "He'll reach for a weapon," Mabel said. Rourke looked at her. "I've been in front of him twice," she said. "Once in the courthouse and once at this gate 5 days ago. The courthouse he kept control because he thought he still had advantage. The gate—" She paused. "He was recalibrating, working out the angles. But there was a moment when I told him about the signed affidavits when his hand moved." She looked at her own hands on the table. "He stopped it, but it moved." Rourke was quiet. "He's not a man who accepts losing," Mabel said. "He hasn't had to practice it." Rourke nodded slowly. "All right." He looked at the marshals. "We go in prepared for that." They rode for Iron Ridge an hour later. All of them, the 3 marshals and Rourke's 2 assistants, Garrett and Mabel, Ruth Calhoun, who had decided without asking anyone that she was coming, and Cal Briggs, who had appeared at the gate that morning on a dun horse and said simply that he figured this was the day and he wanted to be there. The plan was straightforward. The marshals would go directly to Crow's office in town. Rourke had the arrest warrant, signed by a territorial judge in Prescott. The warrant covered Crow and Rance Decker, and pending further investigation, Caleb Morrison and Wes Tully. Two of the marshals would go for Decker and Tully simultaneously. Rourke and the third marshal would take Crow. Garrett and Mabel were not supposed to be at the arrest. Rourke had said so directly. It was cleaner legally if the warrant was executed without the primary complainants present. They rode to Iron Ridge instead, or to where Iron Ridge had been. The house was gone. The stone foundation remained, and the chimney. Chimneys survived most things, the stone indifferent to what happened around them. And 3 walls of the ground floor, scorched black, roofless, open to the sky. The timber second floor had come down into itself. The porch was gone entirely. The front step that Garrett's grandfather had cut from a single piece of flat sandstone was still there, which was such a small, absurd detail of survival that Garrett looked at it for a long time when they rode up. The barn was untouched. The outbuildings were untouched. The fence line was untouched. The land was exactly as it had always been, the grass dry and moving in the wind, the rocky southwestern quarter sitting in the morning sun looking like country that had been waiting a long time to be correctly understood. Mabel sat on the bay horse and looked at the foundation of the house and did not say anything for a while. Garrett rode up beside her. "We'll rebuild," he said. "I know." She said it without drama. "Stone this time, full stone." "That'll take however long it takes." She looked at him. "Your grandfather built the original in 1 season with a mule and 30 feet of rope. We have more than that." Garrett looked at the chimney standing alone above the black foundation. "My father's chair was in there, the one from the study." Mabel was quiet. "Stupid thing to think about," he said. "It's not stupid." She looked at the ruins. "My mother's recipe book burned in Ohio when I was 22. Someone left a lamp too close to the kitchen shelf." She paused. "I still remember what I couldn't save." They sat with that for a moment. Cal Briggs was checking the fence line, giving them space without making a show of it. Ruth Calhoun had dismounted and was walking the perimeter of the foundation the way she walked everything, carefully, gathering information. "The grain store," Mabel said suddenly. They rode to the barn. The grain store was at the back, 40 pounds of oats over a lockbox. And the oats were undisturbed and the lockbox was exactly where Mabel had put it. She dug it out herself and opened it, and the survey correspondence was there, the original debt instruments, all of it intact. She held the lockbox and exhaled. "That's the last of it," she said. "The last of what?" "The last thing I was holding my breath about." She latched the box. "Rourke has copies of everything, but the originals matter. Altered ink ages differently than original ink, we talked about that. The originals are the physical proof." Garrett took the lockbox from her. "You want to ride to town?" She looked toward Caldera. "Rourke said—" "I know what Rourke said." He looked at her. "Do you want to be there?" She thought about it honestly. She had spent 11 days assembling the mechanism that was right now executing in a courthouse 2 miles away, and she was a person who, once a mechanism was built and running, found it genuinely difficult to stand at a distance and wait for it. "Yes," she said. They rode for Caldera. They came in on the north road and heard it before they saw it. Not a crowd exactly, but the sound of people gathering, the particular hum of a town reorganizing itself around an event. People were coming out of shops and houses onto the boardwalk, standing in doorways, turning toward the courthouse square. Mabel and Garrett came around the corner of the feed store and saw the courthouse. Crow was on the steps. Not inside, not arrested, not in custody. On the front steps of the courthouse, in his full sheriff's uniform, with Deputy Tully and 2 other men flanking him, and Rourke and his marshal standing at the bottom of the steps below him, and a situation that had clearly been in progress for several minutes before Mabel and Garrett arrived. Garrett pulled up the gray. Mabel pulled up beside him. "He got there first," Mabel said quietly. "He knew we were coming." Garrett was watching. Someone told him. When? How many? That was a problem to trace later. Right now the problem was on the courthouse steps. Crow had positioned himself on the high ground of the steps deliberately, which put him above Rourke in a way that was partly theatrical and partly tactical. The steps were narrow, and the men behind him created a channel that made approach difficult. He He was talking to Rourke in the carrying voice of someone making sure the crowd could hear. Do not have jurisdiction in a state-county proceeding, Crow was saying. Whatever you believe you have, Mr. Rourke, a territorial warrant requires. Requires exactly what I have, Rourke said. He had the warrant open in his hand, and he was speaking with the flat patience of a man who has heard this argument before and is unimpressed by it. A territorial judge's signature, which is on this document. Federal fraud supersedes county jurisdiction. You know that, Sheriff. What I know, Crow said, is that a man with a grudge and his cook wife have sent you up here with half a story. You burned our house, Garrett said. His voice carried. The square had gone quiet in the way that squares go quiet when something real is happening, and his voice cut through it without effort, the voice of a man who had spent years calling across fence lines and open land. Crow looked at him. Whatever Crow had expected on this morning, and he had clearly expected something, had been prepared for something. Garrett on a horse with the lockbox in his hand was not quite it. That's slander, Crow said. I know your men by their boots, Garrett said. I've known Rance Decker since I was 12. I know Wes Tully's horse by the way it moves. He kept his voice steady. You burned my house with my wife inside it. The crowd around the square had grown. Mabel recognized faces. Tom Hicks from the saloon, Frank Delgado from the general store, Edmund Hale standing near the far edge with his hands in his coat pockets and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. Ruth Calhoun came up beside Mabel on her horse and stopped there without speaking. I have a warrant, Sheriff, Rourke said, bringing the attention back. Step down and we can do this with dignity. Something happened in Crow's face. It was subtle. A man with less practice at watching people might have missed it. But Mabel had been watching Crow for 11 days, had been thinking about Crow for 11 days the way you think about the thing most likely to kill you, and she saw it clearly. It was the moment a man makes a decision that he cannot unmake. Gun, she said, quietly, urgently, to Garrett beside her. Crow's hand moved toward his side. Rourke was already saying something, his hand raised, and the marshal beside him was stepping forward, and Tully behind Crow moved and the two other men moved, and for a long half-second the courthouse steps were the most dangerous geography in Caldera County. Mabel had her pistol out before she was fully aware of having reached for it. She didn't point it at Crow. She pointed it at Rance Decker, who was at Crow's right shoulder, and who had been reaching for his own weapon with the ease of a man who had done this before, who was fast and experienced in the specific way of men hired to be exactly that. Decker, she said. He froze. He looked at her. She was 30 feet away and the pistol was level and her hand was not shaking. You've already burned one thing that belonged to me, she said. I am not going to let you take anything else. The half-second stretched. Crow's hand stopped moving. He was looking at Decker, at the pistol aimed at Decker, making the calculation that Mabel had intended him to make. If Decker moved, she fired, and if she fired, the marshal fired, and the elegant exit Crow had been calculating, whatever it was, armed standoff, hostage, retreat, collapsed. Rourke took 3 steps up the courthouse stairs. It's over, Silas, he said. He said it quietly, without triumph. Just a fact, delivered to a man who needed to hear it in a way that let him understand there was no angle left. Step away from the weapon and step down. Crow looked at Rourke, he looked at Garrett. He looked at Mabel, at the pistol in her hand, at the steadiness of it. He looked at the crowd around the square. 40 people. 50. Men and women who had been his county for 11 years, who had deferred to him and feared him and worked around him, watching now with the particular attention of people who are deciding something about what they've been part of. Something went out of him. It was visible, not dramatic, not a collapse, more like a lamp being turned down. The performance of authority, which he had been sustaining for so long, it had probably stopped feeling like a performance, dimmed and went out. I took his hand away from his holster. He stepped down. Rourke put the handcuffs on him on the second step from the bottom, in front of the crowd, in front of the courthouse that Crow had used as his instrument for 11 years. And Crow allowed it to happen with the rigid stillness of a man conserving whatever dignity remained to him. Decker was taken by the marshal. Tully, when approached, did not resist. He sat down on the steps and put his hands on his knees and looked at the ground like a young man who had done things he would have to spend a long time accounting for. Mabel put the pistol back in her pocket. Her arm ached. She hadn't noticed until now. Garrett reached over from his horse and put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Not a gesture he'd made before. Not something either of them had established as a language they used. He took it away after a moment. She didn't say anything about it. She watched Rourke hand Crow to the marshal and come down the steps toward them. Rourke looked at Mabel. "You were not supposed to be here," he said. "No," she agreed. He looked at the pistol in her pocket. "Lucky you were." "Decker is fat," she said. "You'd have handled it." "Probably." He looked at the lockbox in Garrett's hand. "Those the originals?" "Yes." Rourke took the lockbox. He held it with both hands. "I'm going to need a week to go through everything properly. We'll need formal statements from both of you, and from everyone else, all 8 families. Cal Briggs, Ruth Calhoun." "They'll give them," Garrett said. Rourke nodded. He started to turn, then stopped. "The debt instruments, the fraudulent calculations. Once we've established the fraud, the illegitimate interest disappears. You'll owe the actual principal on the legitimate notes." He paused. "Based on what your wife gave us, I'd estimate the real figure at somewhere around $9,000–$10,000. "We can service that," Mabel said. "I assumed you could." He looked at her for a moment. "There's also the matter of the county land authority properties. Anything Crow transferred to himself through fraudulent proceedings, including the Aldridge land," Mabel said. "Including that. We'll need to trace the full scope of it." He turned back toward the courthouse. "Like I said, a week." Edmund Hale appeared at Mabel's stirrup as Rourke went back up the steps. He looked up at her with his glasses pushed up on his forehead, the way he always wore them when he wasn't reading. "You did this," he said. Not to Garrett, to Mabel. "We did this," she said. Hale considered this. "Yes," he said, in the tone of a man acknowledging a correction that is accurate but incomplete. "But you saw it first." He walked away toward the courthouse, and the crowd around the square began to dissolve, people moving back to their mornings and their shops and their work, talking to each other in low voices, carrying with them the version of this morning they would tell for years. Garrett looked at Mabel. She was still watching the courthouse doors where Crow had been taken inside, the doors still swinging gently on their hinges. "Come on," he said. "Where?" "I want to show you something." They rode out of town and he took her south, not on the main road but across open land, and after 40 minutes of riding, he stopped at the edge of the rocky southwestern quarter, the section the fraudulent survey had excluded, the section Crow had known about and spent 11 years trying to acquire. The ground here was different from the grazing land to the north, more rock than grass, with outcroppings of a particular gray-silver stone that caught the afternoon light in a way the rest of the property didn't. Mabel had seen this in her geological comparisons with the Montoya claim. She had known what it meant, but she hadn't stood in it until now. She dismounted and picked up a piece of the rock from the ground. It was heavier than it looked. "My grandfather never came out here much," Garrett said. He was still on the gray looking at the land. "Said it was too rough for grazing. My father said the same." He paused. "I've walked this section maybe twice in 30 years. "Crow walked it," Mabel said. "Yes." He looked at her. "What do you see?" She turned the rock in her hands. "A geological formation consistent with silver-bearing quartz deposits at depth, which we won't know the actual extent of until we bring in a proper assayer." She set the rock down. "Could be modest, could be significant. You said 80 to 120,000. I said conservatively." She looked at him. "It could be more." Garrett sat on the gray horse and looked at the land his grandfather had walked over without knowing what was under it, and his father had borrowed against without knowing what was under it, and Silas Crow had spent 11 years trying to steal because he knew exactly what was under it. "We need to rebuild the house," he said. "Yes." "Full stone." "I said that already. And the barn needs a new roof before winter." "I know. And we owe roughly $10,000 at a legitimate interest rate." "I know that too." She walked back to the bay horse and mounted with the functional grace of someone who had stopped making hard things look harder than they were. "You want to talk about what we have or what we don't?" "I want to know what you think, not about the silver." He looked at her directly. "About all of it. About this." He made a gesture that encompassed, approximately, everything. The land, the ruins of the house 2 miles north, the last 11 days, whatever was growing between them that neither of them had put a name to. Mabel looked at the southwestern quarter. At the rocky ground with its heavy stones and its silver waiting underneath, patient as the thing it was. I think we had a business arrangement, she said carefully, and I think it has become something I wasn't expecting. She looked at him. I am not going to dress that up in language I don't have yet. Fair enough, he said. I'm also not going to pretend it isn't there. Also fair, he said. They rode back toward what remained of Iron Ridge side by side at the same pace, and the afternoon light moved with them across the land, and neither of them said anything else for a while, which was its own kind of language. The language of two people who have been through something together and are learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to be in the quiet that comes after. The next week was not peaceful, exactly, but it had a different quality than the 11 days before it. Federal business moved at its own pace, which was slower than Mabel preferred, but more thorough than she had expected from a government process. Rourke was meticulous in a way she respected. He went through every document 3 times, had his assistant independently verify every calculation she had made, and found 2 additional instances of fraud she had missed, which she noted without pleasure but with the honest recognition that 2 sets of eyes were better than 1. The statements were given, all 8 families, in sequence, in the back room of what had been Crow's office, and was now operating under a deputy appointed by the territory until an election could be arranged. Cal Briggs gave his statement about the Morrison note alteration last, in the same flat, precise language he'd written it in, and Rourke listened without interrupting and then asked 3 follow-up questions that went directly to the legal weight of the testimony. Morrison himself had left town. His horse was gone from the stable on the morning after the arrest. Rourke had telegraphed ahead to the next 3 stops on the main road and expected to have him in custody within the week. West Tully was cooperating. That was the word Rourke used, and what it meant in practice was that Tully, who was 23 years old and had been working for Crow since he was 19, had decided that the difference between a man who helps build a case and a man who doesn't was a difference worth making. He had given detailed accounts of 7 separate incidents over 4 years that added layers to the fraud picture Mabel had built. Not new foundations, but substantial new floors on top of what was already there. Rance Decker was not cooperating. Decker sat in the county jail and looked at whoever spoke to him with the flat patience of a man who had made a calculation and intended to live inside it. Crow himself was in federal custody, transferred to Prescott on the 3rd day, which Rourke had done quickly and deliberately. Caldera County without Crow was a different place than Caldera County with him. Not immediately better, not transformed overnight, but different the way a room is different when a heavy piece of furniture is removed from it. People stood differently in their own doorways. Conversations that had been held in low voices got louder. On the 6th day, Rourke came to Ruth Calhoun's house where Garrett and Mabel were still staying and told them the fraud determination was complete. The legitimate debt against Iron Ridge was $9,200. The fraudulent additions, the compound interest on simple notes, the inflated principal calculations, the Morrison alteration, were void. The County Land Authority, which was now being dissolved, had no valid claim on the property. He put the paper in front of them. It had the territorial seal. Garrett picked it up. He read it twice. He set it down. That's it, he said. That's the debt determination. There's still the criminal proceeding, which will take months. You'll both testify. Rourke looked at Mabel. You especially. The interest calculation evidence is the backbone of the fraud case. I'll testify, she said. And the silver. Rourke paused. Once we've completed the fraudulent survey investigation, you'll want a legitimate assayer out there. The Territorial Mining Board needs to be notified if there's a significant find. He looked at them both. But that's your business, not mine. He picked up his document case. You've done something unusual here, he said. He said it the way a careful man says something true that he is not certain how to frame. What you've put together, the documentation, the cross-referencing across multiple properties. I've been doing this work for 12 years. I don't often see it done this well by people without legal training. Mabel looked at him. I had a good education, she said. Most people just didn't notice. Rourke considered this. They'll notice now, he said, and he picked up his hat and left. Garrett looked at the paper on the table. The territorial seal. $9,200 of real debt, 0 of manufactured crisis. He looked at Mabel. She was looking at the paper too, and her face had the particular quality of someone at the end of something large who is still processing that the thing has ended. Not relief. She was not a woman who wore relief openly. Something quieter. The expression of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has just been told they can put it down. "We need to find a stonemason," she said. "I know 3. And we need to move the cattle. Cal's been managing, but the north pasture grass is going to run thin by month's end." "I know that too." She looked up from the paper. He was watching her with the expression she had been gradually learning to read, the expression that meant he was not thinking about cattle or stonemasons or pasture rotation. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He looked at the paper. "I'm glad you didn't go back to the saloon," he said. "That night, when you got your things." It took her a moment to understand what he meant. The night of the wedding, the canvas bag, the wooden box, the kitchen doorway where she'd untied her apron. "I almost did," she said. He looked at her. "What stopped you?" She thought about it honestly. "The clock," she said, "and Crow's face when I started talking. Not me. Not then." She paused. "You were an unknown quantity. And now?" She looked at him for a moment. At the worn coat with the frayed left cuff, which she'd had Cal get from the barn where Garrett had left it the night of the fire. At the hands that knew cattle and fence wire and had terrible handwriting and had made coffee every morning for 11 days without being asked. At the man who had stood at a saloon bar and told the truth about not knowing what he wanted because she'd asked him a question that required it. "Now you're a known quantity," she said. Outside, the wind moved across the land the way it always had, over the ruins of the old house, over the fence his grandfather built, over the rocky southwestern quarter with its silver waiting in the patient dark below the surface. The same wind, the same land, the same sky. Everything else was different. And across 2 counties and a mountain range, in a federal cell in Prescott, Silas Crow sat with the wreckage of 11 years of patient work and understood, for the first time in his adult life, what it felt like to have run out of angles. The woman he had looked at and not seen had made sure of it. The stonemason they hired was a barrel-chested man named Ira Flood, who had built half the permanent structures in the territory and had opinions about mortar that he shared without being asked. He took one look at the old foundation and told them the bones were good. Garrett's grandfather had known what he was doing, and that rebuilding on the same footprint would be faster and stronger than starting fresh. It took 4 months. Mabel had not expected to feel anything particular when the walls went up. She was a practical woman who had spent her adult life making do with what was available and not grieving the rest, and a house was a house, 4 walls and a roof, functional or not. But watching the stone go up course by course, watching the thing take shape from the same foundation that had survived the fire, she felt something she didn't have a clean name for. Not sentiment exactly, more like confirmation. The kind you feel when something you believed was possible turns out to actually be possible. The silver assay came back in the 3rd month. The number was higher than her conservative estimate, not by a small margin. Garrett read the report standing at the kitchen table of the temporary structure they'd been living in, a 2-room building Cal Briggs had helped them raise in the first week, rough and cold and entirely functional. He read it once, set it down, and stood there for a moment. "Well," he said. "Yes," Mabel said. I know." He sat down. He picked up the report again, as though the number might have changed in the 30 seconds since he'd read it. It hadn't. "This is enough to clear the debt, all of it, several times, and rebuild, and improve the grazing stock, and help the other families." She had been thinking about this since the number arrived, turning it in her mind the way she turned figures, looking at what it meant beyond the obvious. The Aldridge family. Rourke traced them to New Mexico. They left with nothing when Crow took the property. There's a legitimate question about compensation. Garrett looked at her. "That's not legally required." "No," she said. "It's not." He looked at the report. Then he set it down for good. "Write to them," he said. She already had the letter half drafted. Silas Crow's trial in Prescott lasted 11 days. Mabel testified for 3 of them. She sat in the witness chair and walked the court through 11 years of documented fraud the way she had walked Rourke through it at Ruth Calhoun's kitchen table, clearly, in sequence, without performance. The defense attorney tried twice to rattle her on the interest calculation methodology. And both times she answered with the specific patience of someone who has gone over the same figures enough times that the challenge registers as less interesting than the math itself. On the second day of her testimony, she caught Crow watching her from the defense table with the expression she had first seen at the courthouse gate. Not quite contempt, not quite the shock of a man encountering something he'd failed to account for. By the third day, he had stopped watching her entirely, which told its own story. He received 14 years in federal prison. Decker received 9. Morrison, who had been found in Tucson and had cooperated extensively in exchange for consideration, received 2 years and carried with him the face of a man who understood that the exchange had been the right calculation but hadn't made it cost less. Wes Tully received 18 months and was out in 14. He came to Iron Ridge the week after his release. The new Iron Ridge, full stone, 2 stories, with a covered porch that ran the full width of the front, and stood at the gate with his hat in his hands and asked to speak to Garrett. Garrett listened to what he had to say. He didn't forgive him on the spot, because forgiveness wasn't a thing. Garrett dispensed quickly or lightly, and Tully hadn't asked for it. He'd asked only to say what he needed to say, which Garrett respected. He shook the young man's hand when he left. That was what he had. Tully seemed to understand that it was more than nothing. Mabel watched from the porch. She didn't come down. Later, when she and Garrett were sitting in the main room with the fire going the way it now always went in the evenings, she said, "You were fair with him." "He was 23 when Crow hired him," Garrett said. "I was 23 once. I did things I'd do differently." She looked at him. "Not arson," he said. "I know." She turned back to her accounts. "I'm just deciding whether I agree with you." "And?" "Ask me in a year." The other families recovered at different rates, which was the honest truth of what happened rather than the cleaner version where justice restores everything simultaneously. The parishes stayed. The Delgados stayed. Ruth Calhoun, who had never considered leaving, improved her herd with 3 new bulls and a water system Cal Briggs helped her install. The Aldridge family, Henry and his wife and the child who had been coming when they fled, received a letter and then a bank draft and then, 6 months later, came back to the territory and bought a smaller piece of land 2 counties over and started again. Henry Aldridge wrote to Mabel once, a short letter, not demonstrative. He said he hadn't known what to do with the draft when it arrived, that his wife had cried and he hadn't, which he suspected meant he'd done his crying earlier when nobody was watching. He said thank you in the plain way of a man who means it precisely as much as those 2 words contain and not a syllable more. She kept the letter in the wooden box with the latch. It was October when Garrett found the first real evidence of the silver vein's full extent, not the assay numbers, but the physical thing, standing in the southwestern quarter with the surveyor who had come from Flagstaff, watching the man trace the outcropping with the ease of someone reading a language Garrett was still learning. The vein ran deeper and further south than the original estimate. The surveyor revised his figures upward. Garrett rode back to the house alone, which he did sometimes when he needed to think, and Mabel was on the porch with her account books when he came up the drive. He tied the gray and sat down on the porch step. She looked at him over her reading glasses. She had gotten reading glasses in September, which she had accepted with the philosophical resignation of someone who understands that the body makes its own timeline. "Big?" she said. "Very," he said. She nodded. She went back to her accounts. He sat on the step for a while. The evening light was doing what it did in October across that land, going gold and long, catching the fence line, making everything look like something worth keeping. "Mabel." She looked up. He was turned to face her, sitting on the step below the porch level, so he was looking up at her, which was not a position he'd planned. He'd simply sat down where he sat down, and here they were. He was aware, with the particular self-consciousness of a man attempting something unfamiliar, that this was not how he'd imagined the moment, if he had imagined it, which he was only now admitting to himself that he had. "I know what we are on paper," he said. "I know we've been married for—" He counted. It surprised him. 8 months. 8 months and 12 days, she said. She said it without emphasis, which meant she had known the count. "And I know how it started." "I know how it started too." "I'm not asking you to forget that." He looked at her steadily. She had put the account books down. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to, if this—" He stopped. He was not a man who did this well. He had known that going in, and it was proving accurate. "Marry me," he said. Not the way we did it. Not with a ledger page and 14 minutes and a man in his nightshirt. He paused. Just because I'm asking. Mabel looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a saloon in October a year ago, a clock on the wall, a dish towel in her hands, a man standing on a bar being laughed at. She thought about a question she had asked because she needed the answer before she could do anything else. She thought about 11 days of fear and work and the particular kind of knowledge you get about a person when you are both moving through something that could end badly, the knowledge that strips the performance away and shows you the actual person underneath. She thought about Cal Briggs's face when he said, "I'll testify." Ruth Calhoun opening her door in the dark. A retired judge in his reading glasses deciding that his suspicions were done being only suspicions. Pete Granger on a horse willing to ride to the moon. She thought about what it means to be seen, not admired, not flattered, but actually seen, by someone who had every reason in the world to look past you and chose, instead, to look directly. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. It was a sound she hadn't heard from him before. Relief, uncomplicated and genuine, the sound of a man who had been less certain of the answer than he'd let himself know. "Okay," he said. "Edmund Hale can do it," she said, "properly this time. Not in his nightshirt. I'm going to ask him not to wear the nightshirt, yes." Garrett almost smiled. The full version, the one she had seen a handful of times, that changed his whole face into something younger. He turned back to look at the land, at the fence line in the evening light, at the southwestern quarter where the silver ran deep and quiet under the surface. There is something particular about a life that was almost taken from you. It sharpens the ordinary things, the fence posts at sunset, the smell of coffee in a house you built from the same stones a fire couldn't destroy, the sound of a person in the next room going about the business of being alive. People who have not almost lost things sometimes have difficulty seeing them. People who have lost things and gotten them back, or built new things from what the loss left behind, tend to look differently at what they have. Not with gratitude exactly. Gratitude implies a recipient, and life doesn't present one. More like attention, the discipline of looking at what's there instead of what's missing. Mabel Ashcroft had been invisible for a long time. Not because she lacked substance, but because the people around her had lacked the habit of looking carefully. It is one of the oldest failures of human beings. The tendency to see what we expect to see, to file people into the space we've assigned them and stop paying attention after that. The saloon cook, the heavy woman, the one who manages the accounts because nobody else will. Useful, yes. Worthy of being looked at directly? Apparently not. What changed on a Tuesday night in October was not Mabel. She had been exactly this person for 34 years. The same mind, the same steadiness, the same capacity for seeing through a situation to the numbers beneath it. What changed was the clock on the wall, and a question she asked, and a man who told the truth when he could have told a more comfortable lie. Sometimes that's all it takes. One moment that breaks the pattern. One question that requires an honest answer. One decision to step forward instead of staying in the doorway. The ranch they built was the finest in the territory within 2 years. The silver operation ran clean and was properly filed and employed 16 men at fair wages, which Mabel set and Garrett enforced, and which became the standard that other operations in the county eventually measured themselves against. The grazing stock improved. The North Pasture problem was solved with a water diversion Cal Briggs designed and Garrett built. Iron Ridge, which had been described at a courthouse meeting as a sinking asset not worth saving, became the kind of place that people pointed to when they talked about what this country could be when it was run with intelligence and honesty and a refusal to accept that greed was simply how things worked. Mabel kept the accounts. She kept them the way she had kept Tom Hicks's accounts and her father's accounts and every set of numbers she had been handed since she was 14. Precisely, without shortcut, with the understanding that the numbers tell the truth if you let them, and that the truth, however inconvenient, is always the more useful thing. Garrett ran the land. He was still not easy to live with, which he had warned her about on the night of the wedding, and which had proven accurate in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. He had opinions about fence line that became arguments. He was slow to admit when he was wrong, and knew it and was working on it with the grinding patience of a man repairing something that was built wrong in the first place. He made coffee every morning without being asked. He learned, gradually and imperfectly, to say the true thing instead of the easier one, because he had a wife who asked questions that required true answers, and he had decided that he preferred it that way. Edmund Hale married them properly on a November afternoon in his parlor, dressed this time, reading glasses in his pocket, with Ruth Calhoun and Cal Briggs and the Delgado family and a handful of others who had been there, in various ways, for the things that mattered. No ceremony beyond what was needed, no performance, just two people in a room full of witnesses saying yes again, this time because they wanted to.